Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Now, has the American empire entered the stage where they can no longer afford financially to be at peace? My guest today is Norman Solomon, and we answer that very question. I think you're going to enjoy and be triggered by his answer. He's the author of two books. Number one, War Made Easy. Number two, War Made Invisible, where he talks about the relentless forward action of the American military-industrial complex, and that coupled with the lack of transparency provided by the media, or the extraordinary bias with which conflict is covered today. Now, as we progress in this conversation, it became apparent to me that in an American election, Norman and I would probably be casting different votes, which made this conversation much more valuable to me, because I think the most important conversations that I can have are with people who see the world slightly different than I see it. So I learned a lot from Norman. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Let me know what you think in the comments. Here is Norman Solomon. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
I want to ask you why America needs to stay at war. You talked about, despite reduced media coverage, a continued increase in military budget year over year. And as soon as America withdrew from Afghanistan, I think a lot of us were wondering, where are they going to go next? Because it's almost like a free agent looking for the next conflict. And it didn't take long, not long at all. And we found ourselves in a couple. Why does America need to stay at war?
Yeah, that's a key terrain to really examine very closely. The U.S. government, for a variety of reasons, has been in search of enemies for many, many decades. And if you search for them, you'll find them, and often you will create them in the process or make them more numerous. So the United States was involved in bombing Iraq really for about 25 of the last 30 years, even before the last several years. And so, by the way, as I note in the book, the United States is still bombing Iraq. And last year, the U.S. launched missiles into the country, and the Iraqi government said, "Why didn't you tell us? We don't want you to do that." And the U.S. said, "Well, that's too bad. We want to do it." If you look at what happened after 9/11, there was a tremendous upsurge in federal expenditures, not only for overt military activities, but for intelligence. And so all sorts of new startups set up offices in the corridor between Washington and Baltimore Washington Airport and around Fort Meade for intel. This was just a huge boondoggle. And so these existing military contractors, as well as the new ones, have made an enormous amount of profits. Initially, of course, there were so many profits to be made from the mobilization of, imagine hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops. It's not just the weapons and the ammunition, it's everything else for the contracting companies like Halliburton and so forth. So all these troops sent to Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth, all in response to 19 people with box cutters. Well, for a while, given the propaganda messaging we got from the George W. Bush administration and so forth, people thought, hey, we're stopping weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Turned out those weapons didn't exist. And gradually, it was really difficult to sustain the profit flow through that kind of mobilization, as well as difficult to sustain public support. Thousands and thousands of Americans dying in combat situations in Iraq. So those troops, not entirely, but largely have been withdrawn. They're not the boots on the ground, as the saying goes. But aerospace is going through the roof. And you have all these companies that are now getting multi-billion-dollar contracts for the most sophisticated, technically speaking. I don't know how sophisticated it is to figure out better ways to kill people, but from a tech standpoint, just enormous sophistication, and the marketing and so forth means that the growth industry is huge. And so you think about the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. Well, he used to be on the board of Raytheon. These are companies that are really locked in. There are more lobbyists for the arms industry, the military arms industry on Capitol Hill than there are members of the House and Senate. And if we look ultimately at what is driving the economy of war making, there's a hammerlock between members of Congress, and especially on key committees, and these corporations that are profiting from war. So I'm remembering, Jay, that when I was a young person just beginning to pay attention to all this, I would be in junior high school, and then I started seeing these posters. I grew up around Washington, D.C., and there were anti-war activists, and they would create these silk screens. They would say, "War is good business, invest your son." Well, of course, there were at one point 500,000 US troops at one time in Vietnam. Well, now we wouldn't really have a satiric poster saying, "War is good business, invest your son." It would be, "War is good business, invest in Boeing and Raytheon."
So there's a few things I want to touch on there. When it comes to my first question is, why are we still bombing in Iraq? And is it as simple as we have but there is a contract that needs to be fulfilled? I mean, is it that simple? There's still product to be delivered, and we got to get it out the door. And as cold as that sounds, is that also applicable in this scenario?
Well, it's a one-way contract. I mean, even the Iraqi government doesn't agree with what the
Oh,
U.S.
no, they don't agree. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and why is the U.S. bombing Yemen directly and Syria directly? And those are key questions to which there are no good answers other than the official line that it's to create stability in the region and advance U.S. interests. And like a lot of things in life, it's not just one factor, but certainly oil is huge. Not only Saudi Arabia, Iran as a designated enemy has a lot of oil. They're the Emirates and these sort of sheikdoms. They have oil, Kuwait and so forth. And so the motivations are multifactorial and very powerful. And that's where, unfortunately, the role of the United States-Israeli alliance has become more and more important, because Israel is seen as almost a landlocked aircraft carrier, if you will, for U.S. military interests, if not technically the U.S. military itself. So it's, as we might say more casually, it's a friggin' mess, and it's horrible. And I think it's crucial for us, whether we're American citizens or not, we should bring our discernment to bear, inform ourselves more, and say, it doesn't have to be this way. And there have been historically movements that turned their governments away from policies that were destructive and self-destructive. And I'm hoping that we can turn a page and move in a better direction.
I'd love to know some of those examples, because I want to agree with you. It doesn't have to be this way. I struggle with that a little bit, because I believe the large majority of human history is battling over resources and territory. And I don't know if what we're seeing today is any different. We don't know why we're at war in Yemen or Iraq. And this kind of leads to your lack of transparency between the media and the military industrial complex. We're not really shown the cards. Why are we at war in Yemen? Well, probably oil, maybe national security. It's like these vague terms, right? Like, we kind of got to guess. And so we could say it doesn't have to be this way. We could also say it's always been this way. I mean, from hunter-gatherer tribes through to modern day and everything in the middle, we've been in a constant state of conflict between, us and them to whatever degree, right? And it always comes down to access to territory and resources. And you mentioned space warfare as the next frontier. Like, the hot war in cold places is very much here, right? Satellites are at war in outer space. Media doesn't cover it because there's no body counts and nobody wants to hear about it, but it's occurring right now. And there's a couple of my recent guests, like Dr. Pippa Malmgren, who covers this extensively. And so does it, I'd love to agree with you. It doesn't have to be this way, but do you hear what I'm saying? And I wrestle with that a little bit. I want to agree, but I struggle with it. What do you think?
Well, the reading of human history is really consistent with what you're saying. At the same time, there have been some advances. We had in the United States slavery for a long time. Women couldn't vote. We had Jim Crow. We had bigotry that was enshrined in law against LGBTQ people. There are so many ways that there has been progress, and it's always come from the bottom up. I think it was never those who were super wealthy from the status quo and powerful who said, "Oh, I think I'll give it up." It was always people from the bottom up who organized, who learned, and who were able to change the situation. As grim as the history is, I think there are some examples that if people had not refused to accept the status quo, things would have been even worse. I mean, to take one example, then newly president, fairly recent inaugurated Richard Nixon in 1969, we now know from documents, was seriously considering in the autumn of that year the use of nuclear weapons on North Vietnam. And we were told, and I was a teenager then, we were told, oh, your protests don't mean anything. President Nixon, when people protest on a Sunday in front of the White House in large numbers, he's watching NFL on TV and so forth. It turns out that the huge protests on October 15th, 1969, and then in mid-November, with hundreds of thousands of people marching past the White House in DC and also gathering in community areas around the country, that caused Richard Nixon to decide, after all, he should not bomb North Vietnam because with nuclear weapons, as he had tentatively decided to do, because the political repercussions he decided at home would be just too great. And I think that it's almost like the dog who didn't bark, and how we can try to measure what did or didn't happen. It's hard to know for sure, but we do have historical ample evidence that people insisting that, so to speak, it doesn't have to be this way, can really make a difference. I would quote, and we are concerned about fascist politics in this country, as I think we should be. The Republican Party moving farther and farther right, and I hold no brief for the Democrats, but I think that is a reality about the Trumpist party. I think of somebody who was imprisoned under Mussolini in the 1930s and early 40s, Antonio Gramsci. And he wrote from a prison cell, as I recall, we need pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think that goes to your point, Jay, that you look at history, for that matter, you look at history in real time now, and there are ample reasons for huge pessimism. But the optimism of the will is really what makes possible human progress.
Okay, yeah, and I don't necessarily think it's always pessimism, but just maybe human nature. But what you pointed to effectively was you still got to push forward as uncomfortable. And that is the foundation of America. The wealthy merchants didn't want to separate from Britain. They were making lots of money in cross-border trade, and they knew that a revolutionary war would disrupt all of that. And it did, right? It was the bottom up, and that was the American Revolution. But it was the noisy lower class that inspired the creation of America as we know it today. Okay, so maybe that's a good segue. I largely believe that whoever is the president of the United States doesn't matter nearly as much as the American public seems to think. I think the big trends are generally speaking already in play, and the amount of shifting and change you can actually create inside of your 2-year election cycles, which is what you really have to work with, isn't much. And as a consequence, we have politicians who make very near-term promises that don't mean much, but they can't change the big picture. I mean, the large geopolitical tectonic shifts are already occurring, and we have somebody in the House that claims victory or defeat, but they're unrelated. This might be different. And I've had a few guests on my show recently who said, no, in this and certain rare occurrences, the American election is actually a very consequential geopolitical event. What's your take on the significance of the upcoming American election from an international and geopolitical standpoint?
Well, internationally, I think that it's a mixed picture, frankly. As my comments indicated, I'm very worried about a second Trump presidency. That said, when you look at foreign policy, these are different styles of the same juggernaut, the same attitude. We have Republicans saying, well, maybe we shouldn't write a blank check towards armaments to Ukraine and actually engage in some diplomacy towards Russia. And that's actually a position I agree with. On the other hand, when you go beneath the surface, a lot of what those members of Congress are saying on the Republican side of the aisle is we need to use those resources to confront China. So it's a different style of an attitude that says we make the rules, we have or claim, as the Secretary of State says, to have a rules-based order, but it's really we make the rules, we break the rules. And so that's a bipartisan attitude towards how the United States should attempt to, and whether it should attempt to work its will on the world and really expand the attitude that we just run this hemisphere to say, well, let's try to run both hemispheres as well. So just to sort of sum up internationally, I think it's a grim picture, no matter which party gains the White House next year. When it comes to domestic policy, which we can't really totally separate, when you don't have a commitment to democracy of some sort and the rule of law domestically, then the chances that you can have the people of the United States really determine foreign policy, those chances get greatly diminished when democracy itself is kicked to the curb. And I think that's where, unfortunately, the Republican Party is a major threat to democracy, which has a lot of cascading, terrible consequences.
But so I don't live in the States, so I don't really have a dog in this fight, but I find myself wondering, how could that be when the Democrats have ruled the country for 12 of the last 16 years? And in the event of a Harris win, that'll be 2 decades straight of Democratic leadership with a short 4-year blip. Yet everybody points to that 4-year blip as if that was the thing that landed us where we are. And I'm like, no. If you've been in power for 12, you can't point the finger. Like, you got to take some accountability here. And
definitely. Yeah. I mean, except for the Iran nuclear deal, which I think was very good, the Obama administration was pretty hawkish, despite what it claimed. I mean, a lot of hawkishness towards Russia, for instance, that evolved during the 8 years of Obama. The reality is that Congress has been controlled to a large extent by Republicans in this century, and that has had, I think, some malign effects as well. I would take the point that this is largely structural, and however we describe it, when you have this huge military and industrial complex, and you have so much corporate power, then the needs, wants, and desires of the public in general, it's not even in the backseat. Sometimes it's just in the trunk, and dumped in the river, bound and gagged, you might say. So this is an ongoing tremendous battle. I think that unless we have a capacity to debate and really open up this discourse in a major way, then we're going to be like lambs led off to the slaughter, and even worse than that, be lambs led off to the slaughter while we're told to cheer as our country slaughters people in other countries, which should be absolutely morally unacceptable.
And again, if we've been in a constant state of war for 20 years, like, you got to look to the leadership, right? And say, well, who's been steering the ship to a large degree? And here I got to ask you this question, because I hear this all the time, and I frankly don't understand it. Again, don't live in the States, don't have a dog in the fight. But I hear the threat to democracy argument a lot, and I'm trying to understand this. As an outsider looking in, I would say, a healthy balance of power is usually we sway from one side to the other, right? And that keeps the other party in check, right? We tend to go left for an election, then we go right. Then we go left, then we go right. But in a country that's been on a near 2-decade roll with one party, how could the other party be the threat to democracy? Because during that duration and tenure in power, typically you tend to consolidate. You tend to consolidate power. And so I'm a bit lost on that argument, but I hear it a lot. So what's your take, Norman?
Well, in this century, actually, the Republicans, when you add it up, You got 8 years of Bush, you have 4 years of Trump. So it's basically even Steven in terms of the executive branch and being able to maintain control largely over foreign policy and what the Pentagon does and so forth. I think there has been a qualitative shift. We never before had a president egging on, storming the Capitol to reverse the results of a presidential election. And, the rhetoric does matter. And again, I'm carrying no torch for the Democratic Party. I've been writing profusely criticizing the militarism of the last Democratic presidents, including the current one, Biden. But I think it's important not to conflate all of the people in the White House in the last decades and all the people in Congress. There are very few members of Congress who I would praise. One of them is Rashida Tlaib, who has taken enormous abuse for standing up for the human rights of Palestinians. We cannot find members of Congress in the Republican Party who've been willing to stand up for the human rights of Palestinians as they're slaughtered courtesy of U.S. taxpayers in the last 12 months. There have been a few Democrats willing to do that, but not nearly enough. And we've had a president for the last 3.5+ years and for the last 12 months who's been like this. And people are pointing out that the United States is aiding Israel in mass murder and, by most definitions, genocide. And, for anybody saying, oh, that's anti-Semitic to say that, no, it's factual. I happen to be Jewish, but that's irrelevant. The fact is, we need to look at the truths of the situation. And in the book, War Made Invisible, I point out that the Brown University Costs of War program has documented that since 9/11, the US-led so-called war on terror caused directly about 950,000 deaths. And then if you factor in the indirect deaths, we're talking about, documented by Brown University, 4.5 million people who have died as a result of what the United States has led under the, I think, Orwellian rubric of the war on terror. Well, you look at the numbers, and I think earlier we were talking about that history doesn't just start at one point, but if you look at the numbers of those who were killed in that terrible mass murder on 9/11, 3,000 directly killed. And then in response, the United States launches in October of 2001 under the second President Bush, something that's called a war on terror, but actually kills 950,000 directly. Well, what is that? 300 or 3,000? The math is just mind-blowing. 3,000 die on 9/11, 950,000 die in response. And frankly, there's something to that parallel if you look at what's happened in the last year, because this horrific attack by Hamas that killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th and also took 250 hostages, that's unconscionable. Those are horrific war crimes. And as a result, in response, you got well over, we don't even know how many are still under the rubble in Gaza, more than 40,000 deaths in response. So what is that? How can it be that this ratio exists that in response to a crime against humanity, the US government engages in and supports much huger crimes against humanity? That's no way to run a government. It's a way to escalate insanity.
So if I were to try to simplify that as much as possible, meaning like reduce it to basic human nature, why do these disproportionate acts of retaliation occur? And you may find this to be a silly example, but I'd say look at a street fight. When there's an instigator who takes a swing at somebody, whoever is being attacked, if they respond with violence, will generally take it too far because they're angry, they're scared, they're threatened. We always take fights too far. And for example, if I'm attacked and I feel like my consciousness is threatened because someone is trying to, like, I'm going to respond by taking your consciousness first. It's not right, but it does make me predictable because it's self-preservation. And that's why fights and therefore wars are so terrifying and horrible, because we always take it farther than we should, farther than we need to, maybe out of fear of not taking it far enough. And it's that's why watching a fight is just an atrocious and horrible experience in my experience. And you could say that there's some element of that in warfare, where if we're hit, we hit back 10 times harder because we want to make sure whatever hit us is completely eliminated, and that won't ever happen again. I mean, that was the response from, Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, sort of, right? It was like, we need to finish this. We need to make sure that never happens again. That terrible loss of life, that 3,000 people on 9/11. We need to completely eliminate any possibility of that ever occurring again. I think the response, when it's so disproportionate, is actually very counterproductive, and we've seen this now, right? I think that you look at the strength of Hezbollah since over this time frame. That the more you attack and cut off the head, it's like it's not the phoenix. What's the anti-fragile? You don't come back as you were. You come back stronger. You grow two heads where one was cut off. I mean, that's kind of the nature of this warfare. But first of all, I'm wrestling with this clearly in real time, so forgive me. But what's your take on my human nature analogy? And could it be that simple? And I have to say, no, it isn't. There's more economics at play here. There's more resources at play and strategic influence. But what's your take, Norman?
Well, I think the aspect that you're talking about is very real, of the dynamics, interpersonally and internationally as well. You also, I think, referred in passing, and it's very crucial, unfortunately. This is very profitable. If peace was as profitable as war, we'd have a lot more peacemaking going on in Washington. But the reality is that this is extremely lucrative. I give you one example in terms of the buildup of NATO. As more and more countries have been brought into NATO in the last couple of decades, that has been a new cash cow for the U.S. military. The Harper's Magazine Washington editor Andrew Coburn has written about this extensively. And so the motivations are mixed, but we know that the political economy makes a big difference in the politics of the country. And we can measure it all kinds of different ways, contributions to those who are on the key committees, for instance, in Congress. So that the money that's changing hands is of astronomical proportions, and the revolving doors, members of Congress who later become lobbyists, and vice versa with these major contractors. So I think it's a swirl, it's a mixture where we know in personal terms what happens, vernacular, what goes around comes around. You beat somebody up, it's not the end of the story quite often. And internationally, it's not to be pat about it, and I don't identify as a pacifist for that matter, but violence is going to beget more violence, and what goes around does come around. And even if you're, the big policeman on the block, or the big thug on the block, depending how you look at it, that's very temporary. People remember. People have memories individually and nationalistically. The United States has 4 or 5% of the world's population. There's a lot of crowing that's gone on about the world is unipolar. We heard that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the world is not unipolar in a lot of ways. And escalation is not unipolar. It doesn't work that way. There's this phrase that's supposed to be really good that is bandied about in Washington in so-called defense circles, and that's escalation dominance. They say we have to maintain escalation dominance. And then they wonder why China is building more ICBMs, for instance. Well, if your goal is to keep escalating and escalating, and you think diplomacy is just a rhetorical flourish that you're not really serious about, then there's going to be a lot more carnage in the world. And in the long run, it's going to include a lot of Americans.
So a couple things there. I feel like from an economic standpoint right now, the U.S. needs to find growth somewhere. 2.4, $3 trillion annual deficit, $35 trillion national debt. We can no longer afford the interest payments on our debt, or the interest payments on government debt has exceeded any other expense on the income statement. We need an economic boom to get out of this. That's the only way you reverse this sort of fiscal dominance situation in America. A lot of people are pointing to AI as that potential savior. If we can harness this and win the AI race, that could be the growth boom that America needs. But under the surface, it leads me to believe, based on what we've discussed thus far, America can't afford to give up warfare right now. They simply can't afford from a P&L standpoint. And I'm not saying like they shouldn't. I'm saying that's the thought process and the decision making at the top. Right? Call it.
I'd say, Jay, that there's a lot of P&Ls around. There's the one on Wall Street and Silicon Valley. There's the one in people's kitchen tables, and what works and what doesn't. The professor Seymour Melman, half a century ago, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, wrote about the potential for conversion. And the data are very clear. If you look at what's found and documented at the National Priorities Project, which is a great program, at the National Priorities Project, they've crunched the numbers. There's been a lot of research since Seymour Melman. And if you look at job creation, teachers, installers of solar panels, those who design and build mass transit, you're creating many more good paying jobs than you are in the so-called defense industry. Those in power really don't care that much, especially if they're hooked into the military industrial complex, that dollar for dollar, billion to billion, it's much better for the health of the economy. It's much more efficient to create more good paying jobs for the educational institutions, for the mass transit, and so forth. But that's not what's pulling the train. What's pulling the train is the war train. That's the locomotive. And so we have this challenge, I think, and this is where democracy comes back in. If we can't have really active, democratic, lowercase d, activity, then those who are profiting from war are going to continue to rule the roost.
And we'll continue to see headlines like Zelensky signing bombs in Pennsylvania as this massive economic boom to America, as opposed to real economic growth.
Absolutely. I think that's very true.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned we think of the world as unipolar. It's very much the American empire. That's the era we live in. But in many ways, we're a multipolar world. And I think going that direction in many more ways. Could you expand on what that statement meant to you when you said it? We think of ourselves as unipolar, but in many ways, we are multipolar.
The window on the world is tinted red, white, and blue in U.S. news media, with rare exceptions. What does this mean for the United States? Just recently, when President Biden gave his last speech to the General Assembly of the United Nations, if you leave aside how he talked about how he said he has had a great presidency, when he summed up what happened in Afghanistan, he gave a number of the Americans who gave their lives, and he gave a number of those who fought alongside the Americans, and the Afghan people went unmentioned, which is an example and a metaphor for the outlook that it's really about us. I think of it as jingo narcissism, and that doesn't go over very well. Just as do as we say, not as we do, doesn't go over very well. And Jay, you gave an individual example, which I think is sometimes useful. We all know people, unfortunately, who are extremely conceited, and they just exude a kind of an extreme narcissism about it's all about them. Well, in the long run, they're not going to have probably a lot of friends. They might have a lot of people who fear them if they're powerful. And I think that's true of Uncle Sam, that if we're going to continue to de facto, I'm not saying the flowery rhetoric, but in reality, de facto conveying this is about us, this planet is about us. We're only 1 out of 20 or 25 on planet Earth, but we're the ones who really matter. Then we have a very problematic relationship with the people, the other 95% on the planet. And in War Made Invisible, I go into something I call 2 tiers of grief, 2 levels of grief that are perceived to be of significance in US mass media and politics in terms of war. If Americans die in a war, then there is appropriate respect for their loved ones, for the grief that is felt, for the suffering. If allies of the United States lose some of their troops in combination with Americans, they're given some respect. If the victims of a US designated enemy suffer, as we've seen in Ukraine after this horrible invasion by Russia, this horrible war on Ukraine by Russia, we've had tremendous US media coverage that's empathetic towards the victims of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Very, very emotional, and in quantity and quality, quite extensive. I got no problem with that. I think that should happen. But when it comes to the victims of certain other invasions, like the US invasion of Iraq, there's almost nobody home in terms of US news media consistently providing any sort of empathy. And I think that's symptomatic and a very serious problem. And if you will, it's not only a political or media problem, depending on your preferred terminology, it's an ethical, moral, spiritual problem. It's a corrosion, because when the people of the United States are encouraged to believe that certain people on the planet are really important, beginning with themselves, and that if they die in a war or some other tragedy, that we should really empathize with them, which we should. But at the same time, if we're told, well, other people die, that's just too bad. That's the way wars are. And the United States means well. And so why do people get angry at us? This is on one level, a human dysfunction. But I think on another level, it is an Orwellian formula for telling the people of the United States that we're better than other people in the world, de facto, that we have an empire that should be maintained.
What is your take on American and China competitiveness? You touched on that as being another front, and maybe the next front. If we were to divert, combat resources away from the Middle East and Europe, they'd probably just end up in the South Pacific. Do you agree? And what's your take on that conflict, Norman?
Well, I think economic competition can be healthy. And as I understand it, China, for instance, in Africa, is cleaning the US clock in terms of economic outreach and investment. We can say, okay, it's certainly not altruistic, but it is happening, and the international trade is here to stay, to put it mildly. It's really notable to me in the US media, and coming out of Capitol Hill and the White House, you hear these dire statements about how, China has all these military vessels in the South China Sea. And there's not really acknowledgement of what the middle name is of the South China Sea. I mean, this is a reality where the US government presents the idea that there should be no spheres of influence except our own. That, as I referred to earlier, we have our Monroe Doctrine, but that's just getting started, because we should also try to dominate as many other regions of the world as possible. And it goes back to what we were discussing, I think, a couple of minutes ago, the idea that the United States, I should say, can maintain a unipolar relationship with the rest of the world, that, the world spins on the axis and the US is the axis. It's just not tenable. It's not going to work in the long run.
Well, and it never has. It's always altered, right? We've seen it on repeat in empire after empire. Sort of been 4 or 5 global empires, and prior to that, dozens of regional empires. But eventually, they all crash and burn. Usually, they outgrow their ability to
Yeah,
manage
Jay,
themselves.
you're reminding me of this great moment in Joseph Heller's book, Catch-22, where Yossarian is talking to an Italian. And of course, this is during the Second World War. And the Italian man is scoffing at the idea that the United States is going to be an ongoing dominant force on the planet. It has a mission that is God given and will be fulfilled because we are, as we're told then and told to this moment by politicians, we're the greatest country in the world. And the response from the Italian was, "Are you kidding me? I mean, we know something about empire. We know something about the Roman Empire, but if you think you're going to maintain it ad infinitum, you're basically out of your mind."
Yeah, 100%. It's well, and I imagine in most cases of empire, I don't know this, but the citizens of the empire are the last to see it coming when the empire begins to crumble. Right? You're in the propaganda center. You've got the high conviction understanding of who you are. Your closest held belief is that I am American and this is the American empire. Right? But for those of us outside of it, watching from a distance, you tend to see things a bit differently. Okay, so couple questions I want to throw at you here. First of all, what's the role of journalists today, Norman, and what's the need of journalists today, and how has media changed over the last sort of decade from your standpoint?
Well, the role of journalism, I mean, is so crucial at its best. And I think there are always exceptional accounts, stories, commentaries that we get, even through some of the biggest corporate media. But as I say in the book, the essence of propaganda is repetition, the code words, the catchphrases, the assumptions, who was interviewed, who was ignored, and the overall effect of the mass media, certainly in the United States, on foreign policy has been to present the world as something that should be the U.S. oyster, so to speak. And journalism, I believe, has a potential, largely unfulfilled, of really bringing people in touch with each other and learning from each other, as well as history in real time, as well as what has happened in the past. There's the great statement from George Orwell: those who control the past control the future. Those who control the present control the past. And it's the control of perceptions of the past and the present that really sort of foreshadow what's going to be happening, what's possible, particularly in a country with, I won't say democracy, but important elements of democracy, as in the United States. So, I mean, really, there was a time when I felt embarrassed to be called a journalist in the United States because the usual behavior of journalists who are called that is so deferential to power, serving as stenographers for power. And journalists shouldn't do that. We should be independent. We should have a multiplicity of sources. We shouldn't, as the great journalist I.F. Stone said, we shouldn't make friends with those in power. We should scrutinize them. So I'm still a believer that journalism has tremendous potential. I do think that particularly when it comes to foreign policy in the United States, the mainline mainstream journalists, with rare exceptions, they just go along to get along. And if they step out of line, true, they will not be shot or put in prison like in other countries, but their high up sources will largely dry up. If you are granted an interview with Mike Johnson or Kamala Harris or people of either party with powerful positions in Washington, and they feel like you asked them too tough questions or they don't like how the interview turned out, you've burned your access. And unfortunately, there are very few journalists with major media outlets in Washington willing to burn those bridges. And those bridges should be burned because we should be independent.
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, another guest on my show recently, Gerald Celente, known as a controversial figure, but 15 years ago was a guest on Oprah, regular on ABC News. When he started taking an opposing stance on the Afghan war, he was blacklisted from many media and now runs his own independent. But he drew a hard line, and it cost him his career to a degree. He's rebuilt it now very successfully, I might add. But what, and maybe what's lacking, what do you think about this, is we're very scared of debate, I find these days, in that we don't want our closest held beliefs to be challenged. When in reality, if I were to debate you on something that I'm very passionate about, I have a very strongly held belief about some ideology, pick it, whatever. And you and I debate and you just destroy me. You identify all my blind spots. You find vulnerabilities in my thesis, and disprove my high conviction, closely held belief. In that engagement, I'm actually the winner, right? Because I come away from that conversation more thoroughly understanding something, right? I've evolved ideally, right? But instead what we do is we've just become defensive and louder, right? And we default to rage. What's your take, Norman?
Well, we learn from genuine discourse, including debate. And often in the news media, I'm afraid, and again, particularly with U.S. foreign policy, it's an argument that's two sides of more or less the same side that take certain things for granted as a given, that the United States has a right to work its will on the world, that should be the mission of foreign policy, that certain lives matter more than others. We've seen this again with tremendous negative impacts on our own, if you will, moral core during the war on Gaza, made possible literally through the armaments from the United States. And I've sat through countless discussions where there will be two or three people ostensibly debating, or at least providing an array of viewpoints on CNN or on the PBS NewsHour program. And they're really talking within very narrow confinement. So it's almost like, you're playing, not that it's a football game, pardon me the analogy, but you're playing between the 45 and 55 yard line on each side. I mean, it just doesn't work to ventilate what is involved. And I think it's one reason why when people come to this country from other English-speaking countries, so primarily Europe, they're sometimes shocked by the ethnocentric, nationalistic assumptions of the United States media. And it's really unhealthy, and we should really try to change it for the better.
So when I think of the term free speech, I think free speech is probably allowing people that you don't like to say things that you don't like, right? And that's true free speech. Anything else is just kind of a cop-out, right? How would you define that statement? What is free speech?
I think you have pointed out a really good way to describe it. I think it's Voltaire says, I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. And quite often, the limitations are so extreme that if somebody steps out of bounds, they're castigated and banned. And in researching this afterward for the paperback of War Made Invisible, I really looked at the way in which the discourse, to be specific, about the Gaza war has played out, where very often in news media and US politics, when someone points out that the US is aiding Israel in slaughtering Palestinian civilians, pointing that out makes you at risk of being accused of being anti-Semitic. And it has gotten to absurd proportions. The group Jewish Voice for Peace, which is led by and overwhelmingly has a membership of Jewish people, lead demonstrations, nonviolent and adamant, and often with thousands of people in the last year, And then in news media, they're accused of being anti-Semitic. And it's a way to quash debate. And it's at a time when we need debate more than ever.
Yeah, that's a very common cop out these days, is an accusation of racism. It's very frequent, right? And I guess maybe very recently it's anti-Semitic, but it's not new, I would say. Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of what you said.
I just said, would you agree with that? I think over the last 4 years, the accusations of racism to combat ideas that people don't agree with has risen tremendously. Do you think that's the case?
Oh, yeah, I think that is the case. And I think sometimes it's an accurate description. I think that what Trump, for instance, has been saying about immigrants, Trump and Vance, and about the city in Ohio, it reeks of nativism and racism. That said, there should be open discourse, and let's put it out in the open, because racism does exist. For that matter, anti-Semitism does exist, but it doesn't mean that the word should just be used as a hammer without validity behind it. And so then if the accusation is made, let's flip that over. Let's flip over the rock and say, is it a valid accusation or is it BS?
Yeah. Could you see another angle to the anti-immigration stance that is unrelated to race, but more from just a productive economy and safety standpoint?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, when people say there should be open borders, it's just not realistic. I mean, they're going to be national borders, and it's not going to be feasible to say people can just cross the borders whenever they want, however they want. That said, the immigration debate has been extremely tinged with racism in the United States. When there is a denunciation of immigrants in the mass media and coming from especially the Republican Party, they don't mean Irish people. They don't mean people from
one
France.
Point they did. There was a time when they did.
It's very clear what they mean. It's based on skin color and ethnicity and coming from Latin America and so forth. And while it's the cliche and it's true, except for Native Americans, we are a nation of immigrants. There is a sort of some people are more equal than others undertone. And I think that really should be challenged.
I mean, in a way, the entire world is a nation of immigrants, though. I mean, that's the story of human journey and evolution.
True. Very true.
Yeah. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. And I find myself, again, it's an idea that I wrestle with because it's a hard one to wrap your mind around. And I find that we're very good at cherry picking data points that serve our thesis. For example, I was sort of shouted at in a derogatory way recently and referred to as a European colonizer. It was a demonstration in Vancouver that I was at, and just walking past, actually, I wasn't at it. I was just walking past, and I was kind of chuckling to myself because I was like, European, like I hadn't been to Europe until I was like 27 years old. My parents weren't born in Europe. My grandparents weren't born in Europe, but I get it, I get it, but it's cherry picking a very, very narrow slice of the timeline and saying, this is how I'm going to categorize you. And therefore you are this thing. Anyways. Okay. That might be too much of a tangent, but, look, Norman, I want to thank you for coming on today and speaking about your book. And any last words you'd share with my audience today about War Made Invisible?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jay, for the invitation. I really appreciate being able to talk with you and our conversation being shared with people. The book I wrote before this one was called War Made Easy. It came out, about 15 or more years ago. And the change is really major, I think, in this century, because we saw these wars early on, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and I would sort of circle back to what we started talking about, that the invisibility of wars, it being so invisible is really insidious. And understanding what our society is in the United States, what it's built on, what our own government is doing, is really crucial. And it might sound really corny, but we are brothers and sisters on this planet. And race, gender, nationality, language, ethnicity, sexual orientation, those are really secondary. But we live in a society in the United States and often elsewhere in the world where those elements become major and they blind us to our common humanity. And if we're going to come to terms with and affirm that common humanity, then we need to challenge war rather than accept it.
I love that. I love that. Look, thank you so much, Norman, for coming on. I appreciate it. War Made Invisible. You can find that on Amazon. Also, there's probably a website I should point people to. I'll put a link beneath here. And thanks so much for coming on, Norman. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Jay.